Have you ever asked yourself, why is it that you believe in the current historical narrative that you currently believe in? Yeah, I know, I said it twice again. Yeah, but you ever ask yourself that question? I mean, at this stage, you're probably not 5 years old listening to this, so you've probably got some years behind you, and you've had time to at least create maybe some sort of a general idea, at the very least, of what our history was. You know, what was the story? What happened back then? Hell, you might even be somebody who has it all figured out to like 4 billion years ago, right? I mean, mainstream has no problem telling us what happened 3.7 billion years ago, as if they were right there. I have no idea how they think they got that stuff figured out. Okay, but anyway, my point is, have you ever actually looked at the current narrative that you have, generally cobbled together and questioned the whole damn thing? Before I go further though, this is not some sort of lame Zen talk. That's not what I'm doing. I'm talking because YouTube still allows me to upload videos because they have not banned Anachronistic Affliction yet. Although I'm sure it's coming. It's probably weeks away the way I'm going. Anyway, but what I keep running into as I do my own studies, whenever I read books or I listen to lectures or whatever, right? We get our information from all kinds of sources, whatever. Whenever I'm listening to these sources, though, one of the things that is extremely annoying is that I notice that not everybody, but most people who are writing within a historical context, they very much have a pet theory that they are adhering to. And you'll watch them go out of their way and stumble over themselves to try and put their pet theory above all other evidence to the contrary. And it's horrible because I'm just trying to learn stuff, but instead I have to listen to this dude or read, 10 different pages of just someone defending their theory in the face of obvious evidence to the contrary. And it's funny because you start to read or listen to these things and you're like, why doesn't this guy just stop and get the other evidence and change his theory to match the evidence? Because that is what we should be doing, right? Sometimes they just want to start choking someone. You're reading this and you'll go through an entire chapter of some dude just stupidly defending an obviously wrong perspective. And I mean scientifically wrong. I don't mean, some sort of weird, there's maybe a theory out there or something, or no. I mean, there are people, especially in the mainstream, though the alternative researcher community is just as guilty. But you'll see these people who they're not going to budge in the face of any evidence whatsoever. So what happens is that those people's historical narrative becomes very narrow and very locked in. And when I read this or I listen to these people, it makes me look at myself because I'm like, man, I'm not doing that, am I? I'm not forcing some sort of garbage theory that I have onto people. Am I staying objective? Am I being the way I want to be? Or am I being like the people that I hate reading or listening to? So what I found is that I was just thinking, what if those people, instead of spewing out all this defensive garbage, what if they had stopped during their lecture or their book and had asked the question, why do I believe this stuff? Let's take, for example, I don't know, the pyramids, for example. Why is it that there are some people who believe in the alien theory, right? It's a good question. Or on the opposite side of that coin, why is it that there are Egyptologists that unquestioningly believe that the pyramids were built using copper chisels and wooden sleds? Yeah. Anyway, my main point is that both of these sides obviously share two completely different approaches to solving a problem. But the worst part about both sides is that neither one is going to budge when the middle of the two sides produces evidence that show that, hey, look, there might actually be an entirely different way that the pyramids could have been built or whatever. I mean, neither side will pay attention. And the reason why is because they have a locked-in belief system. So my question is this: have any of those people ever questioned the reasons why they believe in that particular explanation for the construction of the pyramids? And the answer is immediately, of course, no. These people are no longer questioning the narrative that they believe in. And this is directly against the scientific method. So whenever we find any kind of a group or an individual within the historical community that is not open to new evidence that may contradict what they currently believe in, we have to be very, very careful of that particular source. So the question stands. Ask yourself this question: have you really ever challenged yourself on what you currently believe? One of the main reasons why I feel that this is something that's important to talk about, there's a few main reasons. I mean, one of the main reasons is just, it's a great self-exercise that you can do that keeps you in line, right? If you're constantly challenging yourself in whatever you currently believe, that means you're asking questions. And that is how you get ahead in history. I mean, that's how you get ahead everywhere, but we'll stick to the historical context. But if you're not questioning your historical narrative, are you really doing historical research anymore? We know for a fact. Okay, so here's the problem with historical studies. We are missing basically everything. I mean, at the end of the day, when we look at history and we try to tackle all these ridiculous problems that we run into, especially as ancient historical researchers, I mean, it's quite, I mean, it's funny. It is unbelievably insane how little we actually have when it comes to evidence that supports even the most basic outlook on what happened back in the past. The problem is nowadays is that history is not looked at like this anymore. History is just taught in a very rigid way, especially in the mainstream, but the alternative side is just as guilty. But the reality is, so on both sides, it's, and most people will unfortunately gravitate more or less towards one of the two sides of the same coin. But as they do that, what happens is that they get surrounded with more and more people that are just echoing whatever the current narrative is supposed to be. And that is not historical research. That's just indoctrination. So what's going on is that most people who believe that they are a historical researcher, they're not really researching anything, and they aren't making any progress in anything at all. And the reason why is because they are locked into whatever it is they have currently been told to be locked into. And that's a serious problem. Now, we know the mainstream is guilty on this front like crazy. Like that's, if you want to be in, academia in any real sense of the word, and you want to climb that ladder, you are absolutely going to be required to toe a very specific line. And this is not a hidden thing. It is right out there in the open. In fact, the mainstream, as far as I can tell, actually prides itself on forcing people to, adhere to whatever their current narrative is. Like that is what they do. And if you don't fall into that category, or if you don't fall into line within that narrative, you are never going to make it in mainstream academia. It's just not going to happen. But is that how we do real research? And the answer is, of course, no, not even close. There's no such thing as a good historian that is not looking for counter evidence against whatever they are currently chasing. That is how we do science. That is what we do. We are looking for those alternative perspectives. So, all right, back to the history thing. So in history, what I'm finding, and it's becoming unbelievably annoying nowadays, is that I'm finding, people are writing these books or they are giving these lectures, and they're making all of these statements with this air of absolute authority, while simultaneously completely ignoring other scientific, factual evidence that completely destroys their particular perspective, or at the very least would completely alter it if they were factoring in the real data that exists nowadays. So for example, electric universe theorists, right? Nobody's paying it. Well, nobody. The mainstream is ignoring them because what's going on there? Well, what's going on there is that electric universe theory is absolutely devastating the mainstream cosmological narrative. Like it's just being absolutely destroyed. Right. And same for the historical narrative as well, I suppose, because a lot of that stuff deals with history as well. So when we hear somebody starting to talk about, plagues or famine and huge earthquakes and all of this stuff, and they aren't factoring in any of the new sciences that we now know, and they're also not listening to their ancestors, there's nothing more frustrating than hearing some historian talk about a time where there are huge plagues or something like that, or there are huge earthquakes, etc., and they completely ignore the fact that everybody during this period of time is looking up to the sky and saying, oh, hey, by the way, this stuff started the second we saw that comet. And then a lot of those accounts will go even further, and they will actually have eyewitness testimony that talks about the comet being the cause of certain destructions on the planet. It's right there. Our ancestors say it. It's in the chronicles. Our ancestors literally call it out. But the mainstream person giving the presentation or writing the book will almost certainly ignore the fact that they are attributing all of those problems to a comet. Instead, they just go and they look for the most mundane, basic, mainstream explanations, which have very little proof to substantiate anything that they're talking about, and then they write a book about it, and then you read that book, and then you want to kill yourself because you just wasted like 5 days of your life reading this garbage. Anyway, so my point, ultimately, is that if we are going to be honest and productive researchers, we have to be aware that we cannot find ourselves being tied down to some sort of a narrative that is intrinsically false. But that still brings me back to the question, why is it that we believe what we believe? How did it ever get this bad? Think about that. For people who are in mainstream academia, the reality is we should have really been able to look up to those people as essentially paragons of truth, because that is what academia was supposed to be. Now, obviously, it's the complete opposite, and that's a scientific fact. This is not some weird conspiracy theory. We can objectively point out the corruption in the mainstream historical narrative. That's extremely easy. Right? And we can do the same kinds of things with the alternative side. I know I've said it a million times, but it's important for everybody to realize that I am not just getting down on the mainstream, because the alternative research community has the exact same problems, right? But this all begs the question that we've been trying to answer this whole time. How the hell is it that we get stuck into a specific narrative, even if it is objectively false? And I think this is one of the main things that I see, especially nowadays, is that it's pretty obvious that there are other methods and new discoveries that have come to light that have quite literally changed the way history should have been looked at. We have everything from all kinds of new sciences, plasma physics, the electric universe stuff. That's a huge step in that direction. We also have things like chronology, and chronology being tested using mathematics and other methods of, statistical methods, etc., that are bringing new perspectives to the table when it comes to trying to figure out what the hell happened in our past. So this leads probably to the first problem that we experience, and that is that people don't like change, right? That is a very common human psychological trait. A lot of people are not interested in radically changing their points of view, or even generally changing their points of view. The interesting thing about history is that we know for a fact that we do not know everything. In fact, we really don't know all that much at all, which is unbelievable, by the way. And I don't know if I talked about that already. I don't remember anymore, but that's an insane prospect as it is. But we know for a scientific fact that history is clouded. We don't know a lot of stuff. So for mainstream, for example, when they start telling us that they have this perfectly blocked out timeline that goes back thousands of years, and they can read off all of these kings and they know all of these events, and there's no question about any of it. That is intrinsically false, because we know for a fact that history is clouded, not only just because of the second law of thermodynamics. That's bad enough. We also know for a fact that there have been bad actors corrupting and changing history for a variety of reasons. We know this for a fact. So whenever we find that there is somebody telling us, hey, look, I've got this whole timeline mapped out, if you question it, you're the crazy one. What is that? I mean, that is one of the most ridiculous positions you can hold in history, because we know we don't know, and we also know that there are people on this planet who have absolutely altered this stuff for their own benefit. It gets funnier because mainstream people will literally look you in the eye, and some of them will tell you that nobody in history would ever do that, while simultaneously having books in their own library that say all kinds of stuff to the contrary, right? We have countless dukes, barons, kings, emperors, etc., businesses, you name it. It literally does not matter what level of society. We have proof that at all levels in society throughout history, corruption has absolutely tainted pretty much every single century of our history. Right? This is just a fact. So it's weird that we find these kinds of hypocrisies when it comes to historical studies. Now the alternative, they have the same problem, right? So if you bring the exact same evidence, actually, you bring plasma physics to the table, right? You say, hey, look, alternative people, you guys are trying to figure out, let's say like the mud flood, for example. Mud flooders, I love mud flooders. Mud flooders are great because mud flooders are people who are probably still generally, they still generally buy the mainstream historical narrative generally, right? But then they throw in some spice, right? They throw in hey, Tartaria was this super advanced technology place, and suddenly mud came over and ruined this civilization, right? This is an introduction into the reality of catastrophism. Now, mud flooders, like it's their baby steps, right? Anyway, I'm not going to get into it. My point is that mud flooders are interesting because you get to watch a group of people suddenly start to realize that there is way more going on with Earth and in the cosmos than what the mainstream is admitting to, but they can't quite take the next leap to what it is that would cause these kinds of catastrophes. And this is where we run into our problem. Because what we start to find is that people become too comfortable in what they feel they've discovered or what they feel they've fallen into. So once people start to become locked in and feel comfortable within a particular theory, suddenly they will become experts in that specific theory alone, and they will never branch out and take in the rest of the information that surrounds their theory that might legitimately alter everything that they believe. That doesn't mean that the theory that they feel comfortable in is wrong. It just means that you do not need to stop there. And that's the mistake that everybody makes. Not everybody. That's the mistake that we all can make, is that once we get comfortable within a particular narrative, you as a human, you psychologically are looking for those kinds of explanations. You are looking for that kind of comfort. This is just very basic psychology that is absolutely exploited on a daily basis. So the trick is to never get comfortable. So that would be my first thing. Whenever you feel that you are comfortable thinking that you have an understanding of ancient history, that's where you stop, you look around, and you look somewhere else for more information, and then you also question everything about the narrative that you believe. And you go and you look for other perspectives that challenge that narrative to get you out of your comfort zone. I cannot stress that enough. Remember, change never comes from a place of comfort. All right, now I just kind of referenced earlier that this stuff can be exploited. And this is another problem that we find in, well, I mean, we find it throughout the entire planet in every subject everywhere. But we'll focus on history. But in Western nations, one of the other things that has created this extra level of comfort that people can fall into is that Western nations really promote the sense of individualism. Now, is individualism bad? Not inherently, no. But when it is the only thing that is truly supported and truly pushed, that's when it becomes bad, right? Too much of anything is bad. And what we have now in the Western world is we have way too much individualism. So what do I mean by all of this? How does individualism destroy our historical narratives? Here's the problem. In Western nations, and I'm only talking about Western nations, I cannot speak for other countries, though I have a bad feeling that other countries outside of the Western influence are still being influenced, by and large here and there. So run away from that if you're not in the Western nations. Anyway, but in the Western nations, what we have happening now is we have basically all of the media telling us to, you do you. Whatever it is you want to believe, whatever it is you want to do, you can do that, and nobody should challenge you. And you should never go outside of you doing you. That's like the worst thing you can tell anybody. Because humans are not individualistic animals. Humans are social creatures, whether you like it or not. And I realize that, today there is, I don't mean social in the sense of, you have to be on social media. That stuff, that's the poison. What I mean as social creatures is that we need one another, not only for, propagation and basic stuff, but we actually need each other to progress our intellectual capabilities. And the reason is simple, because we're all different. So we all have the capacity to look at the same situation, but come out of it with a different perspective. And those different perspectives, those are the important things that we need to be listening to. Now, what we have nowadays is the exact opposite. Unfortunately, right now in the Western world, we were all, I don't care who you are, if you're alive right now and you're unfortunately listening to me talk, we live in a situation right now to where when we were born, everything was basically already mapped out for us, right? A lot of the major historical discoveries, for example, they were already done, right? Go right now, nobody here listening to this is going to be allowed to go and do any kind of an archaeological expedition at the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's not going to happen. You are never going to be allowed to do that. So what we have to rely on is anybody that was able to do it in the past. And that's it. That's the reality that we live in right now in this day and age. What's going on is that if we want to try and make any kind of real advances in history, we need to be able to dig at these places. We need to be able to run tests. We need to be able to do all of this stuff, and we can't. And why is that? Why are we not allowed to perform real scientific archaeology? And that's the question. And the answer is simple. There's a system in place right now that stops all of that from happening. So what are we supposed to do with this? If we are not able, as historians, as ancient researchers, if we do not have the ability to go and perform new tests with a fresh new perspective, how the hell is anybody ever supposed to make any kind of progress in history? Right? It's not like it was back in the day. Back in the day, like when Flinders Petrie, that guy, this dude was like, he's the guy that basically created ancient Egyptian archaeology. I guess that's kind of redundant. He created Egyptology, basically, right? So Flinders Petrie goes down to Egypt, and he just has an entire run of the place. And people are willing to help him. He's doing all kinds of digs. He's finding all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's just insane what this dude was able to do and what he had access to. And because he was able to access all of the ruins, dig around, follow leads, etc., without any kind of a system getting in his way, he was able to make all kinds of discoveries, wasn't he? All of this stuff that we know nowadays, or not all of it, but a lot of it comes from this particular time period where you had archaeologists able to do their job. Now, I get it. There's a small side of that to where some of you are probably saying, yeah, but, Flinders Petrie, he wasn't like really detailed, and there's probably some destructive stuff in there. And you're right. That did happen. I'm not saying that Flinders Petrie was, this perfect angel. That's definitely not at all what he was. But what he had, or what he was able to do, we don't get to do that nowadays. I mean, if you look at Egypt right now, maybe I've already said it, but you're not getting a dig permit, are you? Yeah, go and try to do some kind of archaeology in the Great Pyramid. Any of you, I don't care who it is, whatever theory you might have, right, to prove your theory, you probably are going to need access, special access, to the Great Pyramid. It makes sense, right? If you have some sort of a theory there, you need to be able to run tests to prove your theory. Right? You're not getting that permit. It's not happening. To make matters even worse, the system that is blocking all of us, I don't care who you are on this planet, the system that blocks all of us from being able to pursue a scientific perspective when it comes to trying to figure out history is the same system that tells you that it is already figured out. It is the same system that ensures that no kind of archaeological progression can be made. And the reason why is simple. Whatever this system is now in place in our society in today's day and age, it's everywhere, but you almost can't get away from it now. It's locking everybody down. But this system is directly responsible for us believing what we believe in when it comes to history. Now, this system is, of course, hypocritical to the truest extent, because on one side, this system paints itself as a scientific establishment. They only want the truth, and we just go by evidence and look at all of our carbon dating, right? That's real evidence, right? Garbage. But what we find is essentially the answer to the question that I started asking at the beginning of this. I don't know where the hell I've wandered off to right now, but the question of why do we believe what we believe? Well, the answer is, unfortunately, it's simple. It's this same system that is locking us out from discovering an objective truth. Now, I get it. There's a lot of you that are like, well, no kidding, dude. I mean, we obviously, a lot of us are well aware that there is an overarching system that is in place in Western society, and it is absolutely controlling the flow of information. This, I understand, this is not something interesting to most of you. So at the very least, it's just a friendly reminder. But here's the problem, and here's something to think about. And this is actually why this question truly matters, and drilling down into the depths of what this question, or I should say, what the answer to this question truly entails is important. Okay, let me get to it. All right, so here's the problem. We are all, not all, most of us are willing to admit, especially if you are in the alternative research community. Most of us are well aware that there is a corrupt system blocking us from doing any kind of real historical science. They're blocking us from doing any kind of they're stopping us from doing anything that essentially changes the narrative. And of course, this narrative has been drilled into the vast majority of people in the Western world. Or implanted. Implanted is probably a better word. It is a better word. I don't know. I guess you could probably still say drilled, then implanted, because the whole process is insane. So right now, if you're listening to any kind of a channel like this or reading any kind of a book that goes into any of these kinds of areas, you're already ahead of the game in the sense that you realize that there's a system in place that is objectively bad for everybody, except for a very few people. You've got that down. But so this is what I would say to you people, the more seasoned people. Ask yourself why you used to believe what you used to believe, perhaps back when you were, say, a teenager, right? Or even a a kid, going back through grade school, or even, after that. Anyway, my point is, when you were younger, before you had time to be exposed to all kinds of alternative information, you probably got a very hardcore dosage of certain historical narratives. Even more interesting is that you may have gotten a very weak historical dosage of a narrative, which is probably the case more nowadays. I think, back in the day, I think okay, hold on, before I get ahead of myself, okay, let's do this. So when we were younger, when we are developing, we are creating a belief system within ourselves. So we're going to focus on the historical belief system. So, we get to learn over time how things, happened in history. And so the first question is, where are we learning this from? Right? We have to find out what we believe. We have to find out who the hell was telling us what to believe. That's the basis of this situation. Now, people not in the Western world, or maybe some of you in the Western world, maybe you got some doses of family tradition, and maybe there was a little bit of some sort of a quote-unquote, I don't know if the word native is right, some sort of personal history. I hope that's the case. But the reality is, I don't think most people get anything like that at all. Instead, what we get is the system presenting us with a pre-made historical narrative that we are essentially forced to follow, right? Because you don't graduate or you don't get past third grade or whatever. You don't move forward without being able to regurgitate the narrative that is being psychologically implanted in you. And please believe that is exactly what is happening. I get it. I know it sounds schizo. But here's the deal. When all of us are growing up in a westernized world, even if you kind of don't go to school, I guess, even if you somehow avoided that whole mess, you cannot get away from the general historical narrative that the entire Western world is predicated upon. I mean, that's just the reality. There is a very particular historical narrative that was created before any of us were born. Remember, this system was generally solidified long before any of us even existed. Doesn't matter how old you are. You could be like 90 years old right now or 9. It's literally irrelevant. If you are alive right now, the system was already in place. And that system, or that narrative, I should say, that narrative has been chiseled into cultural stone. So, what happens is that when we start growing up, we get indoctrinated straight up with this particular narrative. That's not up for debate. That's a scientific fact, right? There is an entire system within the system designed to ensure that all of us get this particular historical narrative drilled into us throughout our entire basically throughout our entire formative years. Why we believe what we believe is directly controlled by whatever we learned as we were growing up. Now, I'm just going to spoil it, but that is the answer to the question. You believe whatever it is you believe because you were taught a very specific way of believing something as you were going through your childhood and then your teenager years. Those years are biologically, they are where you're most plastic. That is where you can be, that's where you're most malleable, right? This is where you can be formed. And of course, there are institutions who are well aware of all of this. And this is why we get this garbage drilled into our head. Now, I know you're probably saying, well, I don't believe in that stuff anymore. I've risen above it and all that. And that's great. And that is fantastic. However, one of the reasons why I wanted to discuss this question is because what I find all the time when I'm doing my own research, when I'm reading a book, reading somebody's, discoveries or whatever, or I'm listening to a lecture, what I often find, and I'm just as guilty of this as well. I'm not above any of this. Let me just put that out there first. But here's what happens. Even if you are listening to somebody or reading a book by somebody who is in the alternative sciences or in the alternative histories, fine, great. And they've got a lot of good stuff to say. But what I generally find, and what you have to be careful of when you are taking in this information, is I still find the programming that was embedded into that person during their childhood still present to some degree or another. This is extremely common. And the reason why it's common is extremely simple. Because the reality is, as we are growing up, we are going through various psychological conditioning programs. All right, now I get it. Remember, I understand this sounds completely schizo, but here's the deal. Anytime you're learning something, that you can consider that a psychological program. You are psychologically conditioning yourself to do something with information, whether that's, learn how to retain it, actually utilize it in the physical world. Psychological conditioning is not just some sort of conspiracy schizo word. It's a legitimate scientific term that describes a process that a human can go through to learn something. And I'll just be polite and just say learn something. So we believe what we believe, at least initially, not because any of us, when we were 10 years old, ran out to Egypt and started doing hardcore archaeology, right? If you learned about the pyramids as a kid, you did not hop on a plane, go down to Cairo, and start digging, right? That wasn't happening. You were doing nothing to substantiate the claims that you were being told during your formative years. It's not going on. Now, of course, it's not happening. You're a kid. And of course, the system is well aware of this. The reality is, as a child, what do? Right? We trust adults, right? We trust the system to hopefully teach us how to survive and how to be part of a community and how to be a good person. That is an intrinsic trust. It's a biological trust that is natural to humans. That's just the way we are, and that's the way it should be. However, of course, when it's exploited, then we run into the situation that we are running into right now. Now I know I'm going crazy, but I'm just gonna focus on the history. What I just said is literally a huge can of worms, and we can go all over the map, but I'm gonna focus on the problem of what we believe historically. All right, so let me get back to, I was using an example of an alternative person, and they're talking to us, and they're telling us new information. And while a lot of their information may legitimately be good stuff, good, solid, scientific, it's backed up by actual, observation and real data, that's good stuff, then what you'll find is that they will correlate all of that back into something that they were pre-programmed to believe back when they were a kid. So they could be doing amazing research, but suddenly they will hit a psychological wall that stops them from making the next step in their particular area of research. This is one of the main problems that I find all over the place. And it's something I just wanted to say out loud because it's, it just reinforces it within me. But when you guys are doing your research or when you're listening to somebody, remember, pretty much all of the stuff that we are taught historically, most of it is just garbage. It is not, you're not being taught this because the system wants you to succeed. The system is not interested in having you, accomplish anything that matters. Obviously, because if it was, none of academia would operate the way it operates. It's ridiculous, right? The reality is, once we have been preconditioned in our young years to believe something, it becomes increasingly difficult to pull out of that. No matter how objective you are or you believe that you are, I promise some of your programming is still in there. So while you may now have an entirely different belief system than what you used to as a kid, or you believe that, I guarantee you there are still bits of programming inside of you that rear its head here and there. right? Let me give a quick example by that. So we have in the alternative research community, there's a bunch of good known researchers, and I'm not going to name any names, but a lot of these researchers believe in something called the Younger Dryas now. The reason why this Younger Dryas thing has popped up is because we are now finding more and more historical and scientific evidence that is pointing towards just ungodly cataclysms that hit this planet. And the reality is, the evidence is showing that these particular cataclysms, they did not happen millions of years ago. They happened extremely recently. All right, and you know, on this channel, as we all know, it's only a few thousand years ago to where a lot of these went down, right? The older mainstream guys, this is anathema to them because they are pre-programmed to believe in the theory of uniformity. The theory of uniformity has done more psychological damage to historians than probably anything else. That this one garbage theory that has been implanted into everybody in the Western world has destroyed progress like you would not believe. All right, so but here's the problem. We find these alternative researchers in a situation to where they say, yeah, they want to go after the science, and they do more or less. But when the science starts pointing them in a direction that does not jive well with what they, you know, with what has been implanted in them, in this case, the theory of uniformity, what happens is that those automatic subconscious psychological barriers are instantly triggered. And this is the power of ensuring, this is the power of the system. This is the power of the system getting a hold of all of us when we're kids, because it gets the opportunity to dig deep and implant all kinds of psychological conditioning tactics within us. And please believe these are not just conscious tactics, but they are subconscious tactics. So for example, okay, so anyway, the mainstream alternative researchers now what they've kind of cobbled towards is this magical Younger Dryas period. Because if they follow the evidence clearly shows, and I mean clearly, there's no doubt, clearly shows that cataclysms hit Earth. We have no choice. We have to agree with that. And so they're looking at that and they're like, man, but the evidence then shows the cataclysms are crazy. I mean, they are so outside of whatever you were taught as a kid that it's just unfathomable how any of this could be true. Right? And this is where most people break down. And this is where people will have those old psychological triggers that were buried deep within them. They will be activated and it will stop these people from moving forward in an actual productive way. So the Younger Dryas, I know, Younger Dryas. Okay, the Younger Dryas right now, for example, they're like, yeah, 10,000 years ago, you know, the Earth kind of got weird cold, or, you know, the Ice Age kind of stopped or something, and then, and now there's a comet. And then a comet showed up or something. It's hilarious to listen to Younger Dryas people try to cope through all of the evidence. So, okay. So okay, so I'm not going to get crazy with this. You guys, most of you know what I'm talking about. I'll do a show on Younger Dryas later. The main point is that what we find is that with these mainstream alternative researchers, they actually lack the ability to overcome the psychological programming which taught them what to believe back in the day. Right? Now, they've overcome some of it, but here's the thing. These programs are deeply embedded into their psychology. Ours as well, mine as well, right? There's all kinds of programs and triggers. I'm not going to get into that right now. I just want to kind of paint a quick picture. So these programs that have been embedded into us, in this case, this would have been the theory of uniformity programming. I'll just keep it like that. Now, what this program has done is that it has conditioned the vast majority of people to believe that anything major has to take place over an extended period of time. And that's the foundational verbiage, right? I don't need to give a specific time. The main point is that you just need to know that everything major has to take place over millions or billions of years. So when our ancestors are talking about things that happened, overnight, to where our ancestors say, dude, we lost an entire island overnight, it's gone, right? This is what our ancestors say. It does not jive with the theory of uniformity programming that has already been built into all of us. Now, for example, let's go back to our mainstream researchers that we're talking about. This programming is alive and well inside of those people. So they've now ran over to the Hunger Dryas to try to cope and to try to, make some sort of sense out of all of the evidence that they are finding. And here's the problem. All of the evidence that we are finding is showing us that things did indeed happen literally overnight. A lot of the destructive processes that our ancestors talk about, these were not millions and billions of years worth of a time period for something to happen. This stuff happened instantly. But people who have been programmed with the theory of uniformity, they have a tough time accepting that. In fact, not only do they have a tough time accepting it, they won't accept it. The programming kicks in subconsciously and it stops that researcher from making any kind of progress because they truly believe to one degree or another that major events, especially geological events or cosmological events, these events have to take place over millions or billions of years. They cannot possibly take place overnight. Now, the ironic thing with that conclusion is that that's completely unscientific. There is no scientific reason to hold that belief, right? An objective person would laugh that off. They'd be like, what are you talking about? It doesn't take a million years for something geological to happen. We know for a scientific fact that we can have, for example, layers created, stratigraphy, that stratification can happen literally in minutes, if not quicker. We know this for a fact. We have this on video, for God's sakes. This is proven science. It's not up for debate. But these researchers, especially the mainstream researchers, they're not interested in any of this because it goes against their programming. That's how effective that kind of psychological programming is. Isn't that amazing? Now, there's more going on as well. I'm just focusing on that to give a general example. Those mainstream alternative researchers, they're locked in with other stuff as well. It's unfortunate, but there is a lot going on there. But realistically, to stop a person from moving forward to find the truth that the system is purposefully trying to cloak, that's all you need. Like you can literally get away with just that one program. And it is pretty damn effective. That's how effective this stuff is when you really get into it. I mean, that is the okay, anyway. So the point is, we believe what we believe because we have been told to believe that. A lot of people don't want to hear that. But that's the truth. That's the reality of a lot of our situation. Like I said earlier in this, whatever the hell this rant is, like I said, we are not flying to Egypt to try and reconcile all of the stuff that Egyptologists tell us. We aren't flying down to Cuzco and starting to dig around in those ruins to try and see where all of those tunnels go and what's really, beneath the wreckage that we have on the surface. We know there's stuff there, but we are not going down and digging, are we? We are not going anywhere really and substantiating or at least cross-checking really anybody's claims, if you think about it. I mean, really, it doesn't even matter. Regardless of whatever you currently believe, the reality is your belief system is more than likely 100% chance just based on what other researchers have done long before you. Now, some people alive today were able to do a little bit more than what we're able to do now, but not much. I mean, that's the reality. Even the alternative people who are really, flying around and really trying to live that lifestyle. And, we respect the crap out of those people, but those people are screwed as well because they're not allowed to do digs either. They're not allowed to take samples from some of these ruins so that they can cross-check not just the mainstream narrative and possibly prove that wrong, but they can't even check their own theory to see if it holds any weight or not either. what this does is that it shines one hell of a light on a problem that I don't think a lot of people are truly understanding about those around them and ultimately about themselves. Basically, what we find ourselves, or the situation that we find ourselves in today's day and age, is this. Whatever historical narrative you currently believe in, the reality is that narrative has been created for you mostly by other people who are either maybe alive nowadays, but the reality, a lot of this stuff and a lot of this research took place way back in the day. Like, for example, I use Flinders Petrie. It's, great dude, relatively speaking, because he got his hands dirty. He went in there and made all kinds of discoveries. What sucks is that his archaeology, huge chunks of his archaeology, are still the only things that we have access to. There's no new stuff going on, right? Whatever the hell he discovered, we're using his older stuff. Not that it's bad, but that is what the narrative is based on. It's based on older techniques. It's based on a time to where people were actually able to do things, and that's the plus side of that. But the negative side of it is this. So, and I'll keep using Flinders Petrie because it's a great example. So, for example, one of the things that Flinders Petrie had done is he started to put together that King's List, right? So he went through and he was like, they found that list, or multiple lists, let's be honest. Everybody knows that. There are multiple lists, and these lists came in all kinds of forms. By that, I mean they came in fragments, they came in duplicates, etc. So basically, they had this jumbled up King's List pile that they could dig from to create a chronology, and that's exactly what they did. But here's the problem with that list. So Manetho, he had his own King's List situation going, and then Flinders Petrie, he came up with his own based off of all of his findings. Those two people's dates were all completely off, ridiculous, and insane. So what happened is that, Flinders Petrie and Manetho essentially met in the middle, is what we could say. They averaged out the dates. And then that King's List was created. So this happened way back in the day, before any of us were born or around. Doesn't matter what age you are. All of this was essentially settled long before we existed. So we had no ability to stop it or question it when it was happening. I guess that's the point I wanted to make with that. So anyway, right now we have a King's List. This King's List is what the vast majority of Scaligian history is based off of. And this list is what mainstream historians and archaeologists base all of their chronology off of. Now, this list was created out of pure garbage. This was not done in a scientific way. This was not done in an intelligent way either, really. At the end of the day, if you go read about this, don't just listen to me, by the way. This is a fascinating subject. Go find out, go see if you can find objective research on the King's List stuff. You know what? I'm going to do a show on that later. I'll do a show on that crap later. Anyways, my point is, a lot of the standards that are used in history nowadays and used to calibrate history are based off of garbage ideas like that. We should, right now, be able to go and look at all of the evidence that was found in Egypt and maybe start to cross-check a lot of this and see if we can't come up with, different time frames. That has been made extremely difficult. While we do have access to the King's List, you can go see them right now, the reality is, A, we have no proof that that is a complete list. B, they might actually have more stuff that we're not being shown. C, you better not ask any questions either, because the reality is the history has been locked down. And if you do not believe it, you are ostracized. You are criticized, but ultimately you are pushed aside. Now, is that how history should be done? And the answer is, of course, no. Or at least that's not how it should be done, but that is how it is done. And because that is how it is done, that is the process that has ultimately formed and shaped the narrative that the system indoctrinates all of us in at the beginning of our lives. So I ask the question again. Why is it that we believe what we believe? Now, you might honestly believe yourself to have created a historical narrative in an objective way. And hopefully you have. And good job. Keep going. But I would ask you to ask yourself a question Every time you think of an idea that you firmly believe is locked down in history. So for example, if you think aliens built the pyramids, right? Go out of your way to triple check that question and look for other perspectives, because it's highly possible that the current narrative, or not even possible, it's probable, or it's probably just is. The reality is that narrative did not come from you doing any kind of scientific experimentation. That narrative was not developed by you going and doing any kind of digging. The reality is you've probably done none of this stuff, but you do believe in a specific outcome. And I would ask you to ask yourself, why? Now, I'm not saying any of that isn't true. All I am saying is that we have to understand that within ourselves, we have all been poisoned, whether you want to believe that or not. And that poison is still inside of you. Now, I'm going to guess if you've listened to this far and you're listening to garbage channels like mine, then that means you're at least on the path to trying to get out of some of that programming. So keep on going. And actually, that's something that we will continue to work on this channel until this channel eventually gets banned, because it'll happen one day. You watch. This channel will one day disappear. And that'll be funny. And I'll use that as a scientific bullet point to prove how messed up, history and science is and all that crap. Okay, you know what I'm saying. Anyway. So when you have a specific narrative in mind, and it's something that you really have locked hardcore into your mind and it hasn't moved in a while, you haven't questioned it in a while, go question it. Go look for alternative perspectives. Some of this is going to be difficult. For example, if I use the alien example, a lot of people really don't want to go listen to mainstream Egyptologists because, the alternative people have also written them off, right? Both sides have essentially written each other off. It's hilarious. The reality is both sides, whether we like it or not, both sides still have good information here and there. So just don't forget that. Don't remove a concept just because you have trained yourself or you have been trained to ignore a specific avenue of thought. That's something to just keep in mind while you do your historical studies. Now, okay, so let's get back to the main question. Why do we believe what we believe? I want to shut this show down because I'm talking long enough and I don't even think I've probably... Did I stay on track? When we believe? Okay, the answer is simple, and I probably could have made this a 30-second video. We believe what we believe because that is what we have been exposed to. And if we find ourselves not looking to expose ourselves to other concepts, to other directions, I promise you, your general belief system will more than likely remain incorrect. And the reason why is simple. It's because we have a lot of work. This is an objective fact. We have a lot of work to do in our ancient historical studies. And the reality is, we are up against one hell of an integrated system that is designed to either block you entirely or completely throw you off down the wrong road. So just be aware of this. That's really all it is. Look at your belief system. Look at what you think happened in the past and go find other resources that challenge your narrative. Because if you're not doing that, you are going to be falling prey to all of the psychological conditioning that has been embedded in all of Western society. So if you are not looking for alternatives, you are literally doing exactly as your programming has instructed you to do. Don't be that little bitch. Don't be that person who falls into line because they are afraid to challenge whatever their current belief system is. That plays perfectly into the hands of the system that is doing everything it can to obfuscate whatever the hell happened in our real history. All right, rant over. I think, yeah, it's done. We'll call it here. It's been almost an hour. I think we've wasted enough of our time. Yeah, I like that. I think a good hour of wasting. Yeah, I like that. 1 hour of time wasted. That's pretty good. Now nobody can say I didn't do anything today because I made this garbage.